The rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the small, salt-crusted shack on the edge of the Philippine coast, a relentless rhythm matching the steady, painful throbbing in Dr. Elias Thorne's temples. Once a man of immense prestige, a marine biologist whose name had graced the covers of every major scientific journal, Elias was now little more than a ghost inhabiting a shell of wood and iron. 3 years had passed since the disastrous Great Trench Expedition claimed his daughter, Clara, leaving him with only a shattered reputation and a hollow chest. The scientific community had called his theories about deep-sea anomalies delusional grief, stripping him of his funding and his dignity. But Elias knew the water held ancient secrets, and tonight, the water was finally coming for him. He sat at a cluttered desk, the flickering laptop screen providing the only light in the damp room. Beside him lay a silver encrypted drive that had arrived in a plain, unmarked envelope that morning. His fingers trembled as he bypassed the complex security layers. When the files finally opened, his breath hitched in his throat. This was classified sonar imagery and high-speed footage from a deep-sea mining drone belonging to the Trench Project. The timestamp was recent, dated only 2 weeks ago. As the video file buffered, Elias felt a cold sweat prickle his neck, sensing that his life was about to change forever. The footage was grainy, distorted by the immense, crushing pressure of the Hadal Zone. At first, it showed a mechanical mining arm grinding relentlessly into the seabed. Then, something moved. It was a blur of light and shadow, a shape defying every known law of biology at such extreme depths. Elias leaned in, his eyes wide. A humanoid figure darted across the frame, its skin glowing with a faint, ethereal bioluminescence. It moved with a grace and speed no human could ever achieve in the crushing darkness of the abyss. It had limbs, a torso, and a hauntingly familiar fluid motion. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias paused the video, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He zoomed in on a frame where the creature's side was momentarily illuminated by the drone's floodlights. His breath stopped completely. On the creature's translucent skin was a distinct swirling pattern of pigments, a biological anomaly resembling a fractal galaxy. Elias scrambled for a stack of weathered notebooks, Clara's final logs that the authorities had dismissed as ramblings. He flipped to a hand-drawn sketch. The pattern was identical. Clara had documented this exact cellular mutation just before her disappearance, theorizing it was an adaptation to extreme pressure. The realization hit him like a massive tidal wave. This creature was the key to his daughter's fate. The patterns were a signature of a hidden world Elias had been told didn't exist. He felt a surge of hope, a dangerous electric feeling he hadn't experienced in years. If these creatures were real, then Clara's work was real, and if her work was real, there was a chance she wasn't just lost to the sea. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by the crunch of gravel. Elias froze. Through the torrential rain, he saw high-powered headlights cutting the darkness. A sleek, black SUV pulled into the narrow dirt track. There were no markings, but Elias knew exactly who it was. The Trench Project didn't leave loose ends. He yanked the drive from the laptop and shoved it into his pocket, grabbing his worn coat. He heard car doors closing and voices moving with military precision toward his front door. Elias slipped out the back window, his boots sinking into the mud as he disappeared into the dense tropical foliage. The wind howled through the palms as Elias pushed deeper into the jungle, his lungs burning with every jagged breath. Behind him, the beams of tactical flashlights swept the trees, searching for the man who saw too much. He was no longer a grieving father. He was a man hunted by a shadow organization, carrying the only evidence that humanity was not alone in the dark. The chase was just beginning, and the deep ocean was the only place left to hide. The salt air bit into Elias's lungs as he navigated the waterways of the Palawan archipelago. Behind him, the shadow of the Trench Project's reach loomed like a gathering storm. He had spent 3 days hitching rides on fishing trawlers, staying off the grid and avoiding any digital trail that could be picked up by the agency's satellites. His destination was a jagged finger of limestone rising from the Sulu Sea. This was the sanctuary of a man known only as the Navigator. Once the most decorated deep submersible pilot in the Black Ops sector, the man had vanished after a psychotic break during a classified dive. Elias knew the Navigator hadn't lost his mind. He had simply seen what the military wanted to bury under billions of tons of seawater. He had been hunting this phantom for years. The Navigator's home was a skeletal structure of driftwood and salvaged electronics perched over a hidden cove. When Elias stepped onto the dock, he was met with the cold, unyielding barrel of a flare gun. The man holding it was weathered, his skin like cured leather. He recognized Elias immediately, his gaze dropping to the silver drive clutched in the biologist's hand. Without a word, he lowered the weapon and motioned Elias into a room filled with monitors that cast a ghostly blue light across his features. The air smelled of ozone and stale, cold coffee. The navigator listened in silence as Elias explained the footage. He began to pull up his own archives, data he had smuggled out before his discharge. This was the dark heart of the Trench Project, a joint venture between the GMA and private mining conglomerates. They weren't just looking for minerals. They were hunting for rare earth elements that existed only in the deepest veins of the Earth's crust. In their greed, they had bored through a prehistoric seal, a subterranean pocket isolated for millennia. They had disturbed an ancient ecosystem that had thrived in the dark for eons. They called them sirens, the navigator whispered, his voice cracking. He pointed to a sonar graph of complex wave patterns. The agency told us they were a threat that needed to be eradicated to secure the rigs. I watched them sabotage the drills, Elias. They weren't hungry, they were defending their home. The navigator's eyes never left the monitor. He leaned closer to the screen, tracing the bioluminescent streaks in the footage. The project used sonic cannons to drive them back, but it only made them more calculated. As they delved deeper, the navigator ran the audio through a frequency analyzer. The sound coming through the speakers wasn't the chaotic screech of an animal. It was a rhythmic, layered sequence of mathematical perfection. Elias watched the waveforms dance, a realization dawning on him. It was beautiful and awe-inspiring. This wasn't just communication, it was a language designed to interact directly with human neural pathways. It was a biological signal that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the subconscious. The merfolk were projecting information and emotion across the silence of the deep. The corruption ran deeper than Elias imagined. The GMA had suppressed every sighting and biological sample. They had staged tectonic events to explain away destroyed equipment to keep civilian researchers away from the Mariana Trench. A discovery of this magnitude would have halted the mining operations. To the agency, the Mer were nothing more than an expensive obstacle to profit. The agency's greed was absolute. They were committing a silent, cruel genocide in the name of progress, and the world was none the wiser. Suddenly, a rhythmic chirping erupted from one of the older monitoring stations. It was a specialized receiver tuned to a narrow band of emergency frequencies. The navigator's face went pale as he looked at the scrolling data. "That's impossible," he muttered, trying to triangulate the source. The signal was coming from the depths of the Mariana Trench. Elias leaned over his shoulder, his heart stopping as he recognized the encryption of the call. It was a unique 6-digit emergency code and a signature Clara had created for their research. The pulse was weak but persistent, a digital ghost screaming from the darkness, begging to be found now. The silence that followed was deafening. The navigator didn't waste a single second. In the belly of a rusted freighter disguised as a simple fishing vessel, he unveiled the Acheron, a repurposed stealth submersible originally designed for deep-sea surveillance. It was a sleek, matte black teardrop of titanium and synthetic carbon, devoid of any markings that could be traced back to a specific government. As Elias climbed through the narrow, pressurized hatch, the air inside felt clinical and recycled, a stark contrast to the humid, salt-heavy atmosphere of the Philippines. They began their descent into the Mariana Trench, the world above fading into a bruised purple before vanishing into an absolute crushing blackness. The pressure gauges hummed a low, constant warning as they passed the 5,000-meter mark. Inside the cramped cabin, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic artificial ping of the sonar and the navigator's steady, rhythmic breathing. Elias watched the viewport, seeing nothing but the occasional drift of marine snow, organic debris falling from the surface like tiny white ghosts. The deeper they went, the more the abyss felt like a living, breathing entity, a weight pressing against the hull with the force of 1,000 atmospheres. Down here, in the Hadal zone, the rules of biology were completely rewritten. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and the darkness was so absolute it felt physical. Elias gripped the edge of his seat as the sub's external lights briefly caught the flickering silhouettes of creatures that defied evolution. Then, the lights began to fail, not because of a technical glitch, but because the navigator intentionally dimmed them to a faint ghostly glow. He explained that in this realm, light was a dinner bell for things that hadn't seen the sun in millions of years. Suddenly, the darkness outside began to breathe. Faint, pulsing rhythms of bioluminescence appeared in the distance. Long, trailing ribbons of neon blue and sickly green. These weren't the erratic flashes of deep-sea fish, they were coordinated. The silhouettes moving just beyond the reach of the sub's sensors were large, humanoid, and moving with an impossible speed. The Acheron felt like a fragile toy in a playground of giants. Elias felt a cold sweat prickle his skin. The claustrophobia of the cabin intensified, every creak of the titanium hull sounding like a scream in the oppressive silence of the deep. A sudden, sharp jolt rocked the vessel, throwing Elias against the instrumentation. He gasped, staring out the reinforced acrylic. They were surrounded. This was no myth from a storybook. These were the merfolk in their true, terrifying form. Their skin was translucent, stretched tight over powerful, elongated muscles, revealing the pulsing network of veins and organs beneath. Their fingers ended in jagged, obsidian-like claws, and their eyes were massive, dark orbs that reflected the sub's dim interior glow with a terrifying ancient intelligence. There were no shimmering scales, no beautiful tails, only sleek hydrodynamic forms built for the apex of the food chain. They didn't attack. Instead, they pressed their webbed hands against the hull, their movements graceful and synchronized. One of them, larger than the others, drifted directly in front of the viewport. It tilted its head, its gaze piercing through the glass and locking onto Elias with a look that felt like a telepathic intrusion. It pointed a long, slender finger toward a glowing rift in the distance, a massive thermal vent spewing superheated minerals into the freezing water. The creatures guided the Acheron toward the vent, acting as a grim honor guard. As they approached the volcanic fissure, a massive structure began to emerge from the swirling silt and heat haze. It was a sprawling, organic metropolis that seemed to grow out of the seafloor itself. Elias leaned forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't just nature at work. The architecture was a disturbing fusion of biological growth and industrial debris. Massive pillars of living coral were reinforced with the rusted skeletons of sunken cargo ships. Glowing conduits, fashioned from the bioluminescent organs of deep-sea fauna, were entwined with the salvaged wiring of downed military drones and lost submarine hulls. It was a cathedral of the forgotten, a monument to the Mer's resourcefulness and their long, silent observation of the surface world. They had taken the refuse of humanity and woven it into the very fabric of their civilization. The scale of the city was immense, stretching into the dark canyons of the trench like a glowing fungal lung. As the navigator steered the sub into a docking aperture within the coral metal hybrid structure, the hum of the engine suddenly died. The cabin lights flickered and then vanished, plunging them into a suffocating velvety dark. The emergency red lights failed to kick in. The sonar went silent. For a moment, the only sound was the frantic thumping of Elias's heart. Then, the communication system, which should have been dead without power, let out a burst of static. The white noise smoothed out into a clear, melodic frequency that Elias would have known anywhere. A voice, familiar and filled with a strange, resonant echo, vibrated through the speakers. It wasn't a distress call, it was a greeting. "I knew you would come, Dad," the voice whispered, cutting through the silence. Elias's breath hitched as the realization of what his daughter had become began to settle into his bones. The hatch of the Acheron surrendered to the pressure with a resonant metallic groan. As Elias stepped out onto a ledge of compressed sediment and rusted hull plates, he expected to drown. Instead, he inhaled a thick, humid atmosphere that tasted of salt, ozone, and ancient minerals. The navigator followed, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm, his eyes scanning the bioluminescent vaulted ceiling. They were standing in the heart of the sanctuary, a pocket of survival carved into the stone of the Mariana Trench. The walls were a tapestry of living coral and salvaged steel, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic throb that felt like a heartbeat. Glowing organisms trapped in glass tubes acted as lanterns, bathing the chamber in a soft, ethereal violet glow. Out of the shadows of a coral pillar, a figure emerged. Elias felt his knees buckle. It was Clara. She was no longer the girl who had vanished 3 years ago. Her skin had turned a ghostly, translucent white, revealing the intricate, glowing circulatory system beneath. Her eyes had widened, the pupils now vast, dark pools designed to drink in the faintest shimmer of light. Faint gills pulsed at her neck, and her fingers were long, connected by a delicate, iridescent webbing. She moved with a weightless elegance that suggested the pressurized air was too thin for her new form. Elias reached out, his hand trembling, and when her skin touched his, it was humming with a low-frequency vibration that resonated in his marrow, a biological frequency that spoke directly to his nerves. Clara's voice seemed to echo from the walls, a melodic fusion of human speech and the clicking dialect of the mer. She explained the truth hidden for eons. The creatures weren't monsters or visitors from another star. They were the first diversion, a branch of the human family tree that had retreated to the depths millennia ago during a surface cataclysm. While those on the surface built cities of fire, the mer evolved in the dark, adapting to the crushing weight. They had watched humanity from the shadows, salvaging what was lost and building a civilization of silent observation. Clara had been found dying after her ship went down, and the mer had saved her through a symbiotic biological infusion that rewrote her genetic code to survive the Hadal zone. But this paradise was dying. Clara led Elias to a transparent membrane overlooking the wider city. Beyond, the water was cloudy, choked with a gray, suffocating silt. She spoke of the trench project, the massive industrial drills and sonar arrays of the military corporate alliance. The acoustic pollution was a death sentence. To the mer, sound was vision and life. The relentless, low-frequency thrumming of the mining rigs was shattering their nervous systems, driving the young to madness and leaving the hunters blind in the dark. They weren't attacking the rigs out of malice. They were screaming in pain, trying to silence the noise that was flaying their minds. Elias grabbed her shoulders, pleading with her to return to the surface. He promised he could find a way to reverse the process, to bring her back to the sunlight. Clara only looked at him with a profound, tragic sadness. She raised her hand, showing him how the pressure of the air pocket was already causing her skin to crack and her breathing to become labored. She was a bridge, a translator for two species that had forgotten they were kin, but she was tethered to the abyss. Her biology was now fundamentally tied to the crushing weight. To rise was to die. The navigator suddenly stiffened. He pulled a scanner from his belt, its screen flickering with blood-red warnings. The silence of the sanctuary was shattered by a deep, bone-shaking vibration. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thudding, the sound of high-yield propulsion systems. The trench project hadn't just followed the drive. They had tracked the Acheron's signature through the navigator's own hidden beacon. Above the coral spires, the water began to churn as a fleet of military submersibles descended like a swarm of predatory insects. A high-pitched, piercing alarm began to wail throughout the sanctuary, a biological scream from the city itself. The military wasn't here for a dialogue. They were coming with depth charges and sonic cannons, ready to clear the infestation to reach the riches below. The navigator stood frozen, but his eyes weren't fixed on the descending military fleet. They were fixed on the floor. The scanner in his hand wasn't just a tracking device. It was a transmitter, a tether that had dragged the wolves to the door of a hidden world. Elias looked at the man he had trusted, the man who had supposedly been his only ally in this watery grave, and saw the crushing weight of guilt etched into his weathered face. The navigator's hand trembled as he lowered the device. He admitted it then, his voice barely a whisper against the rising thrum of the military engines. He hadn't been fired from the trench project. He had been recruited by them. They knew Elias was the only one who had the linguistic keys to the mare's biological signatures, and they needed the navigator to lead him right into their nest. He was a lure, and Elias was the hook they intended to use to gut this civilization. The realization stung worse than the salt water. All those months of searching, all the shared dangers had been a calculated performance. The navigator wasn't an outcast, he was a scout. Above them, the water turned into a chaotic vortex of silt and fire. The first wave of depth charges detonated against the upper thermal vents, sending shock waves through the air pocket that nearly threw Elias from the ledge. The sanctuary, a masterpiece of millennia of slow growth and careful salvaging, began to groan under the onslaught. Giant slabs of ancient coral, once vibrant and pulsing with life, cracked like bone. The military didn't care about the architecture or the history. They saw only the invasive species obstructing a trillion-dollar mineral vein. They unleashed their primary weapon, the sonic cannons. These weren't traditional explosives, but focused arrays of high-frequency sound designed to resonate at the exact frequency of the mer's nervous systems. To the mer, who lived in a world of pure vibration. This was like having their very souls flayed open by invisible knives. The sound was a physical presence, a wall of agony that pushed through the water and the air alike. Elias watched in horror as the merfolk around them collapsed. The creatures who had moved with such predatory grace were suddenly seized by violent convulsions. Their translucent skin turned a bruised, angry purple as their internal organs reacted to the acoustic bombardment. Clara screamed, a sound that was half human and half melodic vibration, and fell to her knees. Her gills flared frantically, struggling to find oxygen in an atmosphere now vibrating with the sound of their destruction. Elias grabbed her, shielding her body with his own. Even as the walls of the sanctuary began to cave in, they had to move. They had to find a way to the lower levels where the sound might be muffled by the density of the trench floor. Every step was a battle against the crushing pressure and the deafening roar of the invasion. The floor beneath them buckled as a massive mining drill pierced the ceiling of the upper chamber, its diamond-tipped teeth grinding through coral that had taken 10,000 years to grow. The navigator watched the carnage through the transparent membrane, his face illuminated by the flashes of the depth charges. He saw a mer-child, its bioluminescence flickering like a dying candle crushed under a falling piece of a salvaged ship hull. The cold professionalism of the Black Ops pilot shattered. This wasn't a tactical extraction, it was a massacre of a peaceful, ancient race. He looked at Elias, then at Clara, and finally at the controls of his stealth submersible, the Acheron, still docked nearby. With a roar of defiance, he sprinted back toward the sub. He didn't flee, he didn't dive for the surface. He bypassed the military's remote override and brought the Acheron's weapon systems online, systems the Trench Project thought they controlled. He began to fire on the descending mining drones, drawing their fire away from the sanctuary's heart. He was one man against a fleet, a ghost in the machine finally choosing a side. His sacrifice was a desperate attempt to wash the blood from his hands. Elias and Clara reached a hidden chamber deep within the thermal vent's base, where the heat was stifling and the water hummed with a different kind of energy. The sonic cannons were still pounding above, but here, the Mer had a secret. Clara gripped Elias's hand, her eyes wide with a terrifying resolve. She pointed toward a massive, pulsing crystalline structure at the center of the vent, a biological battery of immense power. She told him that the Mer were never truly defenseless. They had a failsafe, a biological pulse designed to be a last resort against any surface threat. If triggered, it would release an electromagnetic wave so powerful it would fry every piece of technology within a 100-mile radius, sinking the fleet and silencing the noise forever. But there was a cost. The energy release would illuminate the trench with a brilliance that would be seen by every satellite on Earth, exposing their existence to a world that would never stop hunting them. Clara looked at her father, the weight of 2 worlds resting on her shoulders, her skin glowing with a fierce, desperate light. "Once we light this fire, Dad," she whispered, "the dark will never be safe again." The water outside the crystalline chamber was no longer the serene midnight blue of the deep. It was a chaotic kaleidoscope of tracer fire and bioluminescent streaks. The navigator, piloting the Acheron with the desperate precision of a man seeking penance, swung the stealth submersible into the path of a cluster of torpedoes. Each explosion sent a concussive roar through the sanctuary's walls. Above him, the Mer swarmed like a silver cloud of angry wasps. They had no guns, but they had the immense pressure of the abyss on their side. They tore at the delicate sensor arrays of the military drones with webbed hands that possessed the raw strength of hydraulic presses. Drones sparked and spiraled into the darkness, their mechanical screams lost in the oceanic weight. Yet for every drone the Mer disabled, 2 more descended from the surface. The Trench Project was a relentless hydra, and its metallic heads were infinite. Elias watched through the shimmering membrane as the navigator's sub took a glancing blow, spinning wildly before stabilizing. The pilot was buying them minutes, and those minutes were being paid for in metal. Clara pulled Elias toward the center of the chamber, where the crystalline structure pulsed with a rhythmic golden light. It felt like the heartbeat of the Earth itself. The heat from the thermal vent was becoming unbearable, the water around the crystals shimmering with volcanic intensity that distorted the air. Clara's skin began to glow with a matching resonance. She looked at the core, then back at her father, her eyes reflecting a wisdom that was no longer entirely human. She explained that the pulse could not be triggered remotely. It required a living biological interface, a conductor to bridge the gap between the vent's raw geothermal energy and the MER's complex sensory network. She had to enter the core's inner sanctum. Once inside, the pressure and the energy surge would seal the entrance forever. She would not die, but she would be anchored to the trench, a living part of the failsafe system. Elias felt a coldness that the volcanic heat could not touch. To save this world, he had to lose his daughter for a second time, and this time, there would be no rescue mission. A discarded military comms unit on Elias's belt crackled to life, hissing through the static of the sonic cannons. Dr. Thorne, the voice of the Trench Project's commander, cut through the chaos, cold and devoid of any human empathy. Cease this interference. You are protecting an invasive biological anomaly at the cost of global economic progress. Step aside now, and we can still ensure your safe extraction. Elias gripped the unit, his knuckles white. Progress! He spat, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and profound grief. You are murdering an entire civilization for stones and batteries. You aren't building the future, you're just grave robbing the past. The commander's response was a silence, followed by a sharp order to increase the intensity of the sonic cannons. The vibration intensified, cracking the crystals around them. Elias looked at the man's shadow through the viewport, a ghost of the surface world he once belonged to. He realized then that greed was a deafening mask. It had no ears for the songs of the deep or the pleas of a desperate father. There was no negotiation left, only the inevitable. Clara touched his face, her hand warm against his salt-stained cheek. "It's the only way, Dad," she whispered. With a final look, she stepped into the swirling vortex of the core. The light intensified until it was blinding, a pure electric blue that reached into Elias's marrow. He watched as her silhouette merged with the crystal, her form becoming part of the eternal light. Suddenly, the sanctuary fell silent. The sonic cannons died. The drone lights went dark. A massive wave of blue energy erupted from the thermal vent, expanding outward like a supernova. Elias scrambled back toward the Acheron as the shockwave hit. Every screen on military vessels turned to static. Bioluminescence of her people flickered one last time. Elias watched through glass as the energy pulse leveled the silt, the city of the Mer vanishing behind a curtain of shadow. The ocean reclaimed its quiet, swallowing battle remnants. The roar of the deep was replaced by the rhythmic thrumming of a low-tide surf. Elias Thorne opened his eyes to a world that was far too bright. The Philippine sun was a cruel white eye in a cloudless sky, burning against his salt-encrusted skin. He was lying on a stretch of obsidian sand, his fingers curled into the wet grit. A local fishing banca bobbed in the shallows nearby, the fishermen shouting in a dialect he barely recognized through the ringing in his ears. They had found him clinging to a piece of wreckage, the remains of a life support pod that had somehow survived the crushing ascent after the Acheron was torn apart by the energy surge. As they pulled him onto the wooden deck, Elias reached for the waterproof drive in his pocket, the one containing the sonar maps and the footage of the sanctuary, only to find it cold and inert. The pulse had been absolute. Every circuit was fried, every byte of data scrambled into digital static. He was the only witness left to a miracle that had been erased from the record of man. In the weeks that followed, the machinery of the surface world worked faster than any deep-sea predator. The Trench Project was officially disbanded, but not for the reasons Elias knew. The government issued a sterile press release, labeling the events in the Mariana Trench as an unprecedented tectonic shift, an undersea earthquake that had triggered a localized electromagnetic phenomenon. They spoke of a tragic maritime accident that had claimed the lives of several private contractors and researchers. When Elias tried to speak of the Mer, of the bioluminescent city, and of his daughter's sacrifice, he was met with the cold, pitying stares reserved for those broken by the pressure of the abyss. The media painted him as a man driven mad by grief, a disgraced scientist clutching at ghosts to explain a daughter's disappearance 3 years prior. His maps were gone, the navigator was missing and presumed dead, and the ocean held its breath. Elias eventually returned to his secluded coastal hut, the same place where this journey had begun with a mysterious drive. The black SUVs no longer sat on the ridge. The military had what they wanted, the silence of the deep. They believed the Mer were gone, wiped out by the very pulse that had saved them. Elias let them believe it. He spent his days sitting on the porch, watching the horizon where the blue of the water met the blue of the sky. He was no longer a man haunted by a ghost. The crushing weight that had sat on his chest for 3 years had lifted, replaced by a profound quiet peace. He knew the truth. Clara wasn't lost in the darkness. She was the heart of it. She was the sentinel of a civilization that had existed long before humanity learned to walk upright, and she would be there long after they were gone. One evening, as a bruised purple dust settled over the Palawan coast, Elias walked down to the water's edge. In his hand, he held a small silver locket, the one Clara had left behind before the expedition that changed everything. Inside was a faded photograph of a younger Elias holding a laughing child. He stood where the waves lapped at his ankles, the water unnaturally calm. With a steady hand, he tossed the locket into the surf. It didn't sink immediately. Instead, a soft, pale glow began to emanate from beneath the ripples. A hand, slender and translucent, with skin that shimmered like crushed pearls, rose slowly from the foam. The fingers were elongated, elegant, and topped with the subtle grace of an apex predator. The hand caught the locket with a fluid, haunting precision. For a heartbeat, Elias saw the flicker of a bioluminescent pattern on the wrist, a pattern he knew better than his own name. Then, with a gentle swirl of water, the hand vanished back into the depths. The ocean is vast, a sprawling kingdom of shadow that covers the majority of our planet, yet we treat it like a desert or a dump. Elias realized then that the greatest secret of the deep wasn't that the mer existed, it was that they were no longer content to remain a myth. They were waiting, watching from the silence, enduring the noise of our world until we finally learned to listen. As the view panned out, far beyond the reach of his small beach, the dark expanse of the global oceans began to change. From the coast of Japan to the fjords of Norway, from the Cape of Good Hope to the icy waters of the Antarctic, thousands of tiny bioluminescent lights began to glow just beneath the surface. They were a constellation of hidden lives, a silent army of the abyss rising to witness the turning of the tide. The sightings were no longer just whispers in the dark or grainy footage on a lost drive. They were a message. The deep was waking up, and the world was finally about to see what truly lived beneath the waves.